over to about 12:20. Would that be acceptable? Perhaps we can... No good. Maddening, I'm sorry. It's as frustrating for me as it is for you, so be patient if you would. There we are. Good. One, two, three, four. I was trying to make a start here. One, two. Could I just try? No, it's not clearly not working. Oh dear me. Could I just give it a try? It's maddening. I mean, I don't want you to all wander off to lunch, because today I think is going to be probably the most important of the 5 lectures, insofar as it's terra incognita for many of us, including myself when I was preparing for this. It's gone again. It's faded away. Brrr, maddening. It's a continuation of this morning's session on music, by the sound of it. Oh, isn't this maddening? I can't tell you. But it will be fixed. Just be patient if you would. Let me just... Can you hear me at all? Barely.
Hello, hello, testing. So you need to stand here. Let me see if I'm not going to put it on your chin, but I'm going to...
Is it?
It's just the distance between, and everybody wants to get, because you say such beautiful, you teach us such beautiful things that we don't want to miss a word.
That's what I agree with. I can hold it now. Is that all right?
Close to your mouth, let's see.
Like that. Can we just try that now? 1, 2, 3. Is that good? Yes. Okay. It's clearly my fault, and I apologize, therefore. My mouth is in the wrong place with respect to the microphone. Say again? I see. Okay. There we are. Just there. I will do my best. There we are. We'll try again. Oh, gosh. Okay. We'll give it a try. Not sure what happened to our IT. If my IT man comes, we'll suddenly stop and start again. But let me just say, by way of introduction, first of all, it's good to see you all, because I thought a lot of you would have drifted away at the subject today. But in fact... That's okay. But in fact, the theme of this course It's very poor, isn't it? Not good. Something's not right. Oh, goodness me. Is there a volume control on the... would it be a battery problem with the... I think so.
And also because we're too attached to your lecture, we must let go. We're all too attached to want to...
No, well, I know that. Yeah, I think so. It's just, no. Good. We will get it right. Hammering away. No, not at all. 1, 2, 3.
Hello. There's nothing.
Good. Oh, gosh. We don't have a plan B for this. It's just awful, isn't it? Goodness.
Get another microphone.
That's what he's going to do. I don't know what the answer is.
More techies here.
It may just be a battery problem. I don't know.
Yes, but nothing's coming out.
We have no microphone.
Normally assists you is trying to get classroom support service.
What is it?
Because it was working perfectly for the previous lecture.
What is it?
Is there no spare ones anywhere?
Do you think it's only the microphone though?
Or it could be a battery. It's only the microphone.
If it's only the microphone, then it should be solvable, but I just wanted to...
Or a battery. Oh, lordy.
Where do you put the... Open the door. We sort of had it just now. Okay, so let's...
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Nothing happening. No.
Where are these guys? Where's this man?
Can I...
Maybe if you stand in a certain place, it's hello. Hello. There's nothing here. It's dead.
I think it's very One, two, three, four, five, six. Yes, there we go. That's better. It's better now. Just try. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's over-modulated.
Which means not too loud.
So the sound is it's
no batteries, you change the record.
it's charging. I think that's the difficulty.
She's asking about the charging. That's internally charged. There's no battery.
There's nothing okay. But now, have you not got a completely new system? Because I complained yesterday. I sent an email. I said that the sound is.
Handheld mic from classroom support. I think the guys on this way.
So
What
should
do
we
we do with
try?
these good people there who've got lunch engagements and things? Do we reschedule?
No, don't worry. I think everything will work out.
I think maybe.
Everything will work out.
Do you think it's possible to speak without the microphone completely?
Not with the back. It would be, no, not with the back for 1 hour.
I think it will just be fine. It's only 10 minutes. It's not the end of the world. You're the fixer-upper. That's quite simple, but I think we all have to just relax and then
coming from classroom support.
Hopefully.
It's on its way,
Yeah.
which will be separate from this system which is currently there. So just give it a minute.
Okay. Thank you.
We've got 2 people phoning them till we get hold of a human being, and we've also sent an email in the proper way. They will come. You just need to
a microphone. Is that volume acceptable? Yes. Gosh, now I've got 1 hour of this, for goodness sake. Okay, we will do it.
And then we will, and I'll just get the
Yeah.
down here.
Okay, now we need to get the lights down. How do I turn? Can you go back to where we were? It's important we see the slides. Okay, I'm going to do my very best, and please yell if it all collapses and doesn't work out. So, the title of this course is Artistic and Cultural Cross-Currents. And yesterday we were saturated with the artistic, lots and lots of pictures. Today, because of the prohibition of representing the human figure in Islam, certainly in the context of worship in the mosque, we have now to go to the other side of this equation, and that is the cultural cross-current. And this is intellectually a bigger challenge. It was certainly a big challenge for me, and if I may be so bold, I think it's going to be a challenge for you as well, to appreciate the subtleties that Islam has contributed, the scientific and cultural contributions Islam has made to Western culture. And I'm going to be so bold as to say that I think Islam is one of the pillars that supports Western culture. And to indicate that, the murmuring, I think, is because the perception of Islam for most of us today is what we see in the evening news. The intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the latest horror perpetrated by somebody who's hijacked the religion in the name of some false philosophy. Whereas the real Islam is completely different and, as I say, underpins Western culture. And I say that because it was the Muslims who were the first to identify a galaxy outside our own solar system, the Andromeda galaxy, trillions and trillions of orbiting stars, the first people to do that. They also invented algebra. What is algebra? It's the assigning of a letter to a group of numbers. Why is that important? Because then you can manipulate large groups of numbers by short-circuiting the massive calculations involved by just linking letters together in such a way that Einstein could summarize one of the most important fundamental laws of physics that governs the Earth and space, E equals mc squared. And if it were not for the Muslims, we would not have algebra. The word algebra comes from the Arabic, al-jabr. And al-jabr means bringing together. And so here we have a fundamental concept that underpins Western mathematics. They not only contributed that, they introduced the number 0 into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Why is that important? Because then you can compound groups of numbers, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, million, done in 3 seconds. But without 0, that's a challenge, multiplying all these complicated numbers together. They also introduced the way we describe numbers. Before the Muslims, the way numbers were described were borrowing letters from the Roman alphabet. So if you wanted to say somebody wanted the number 3, it would be I. And that gets a bit complicated if you want to say, what is 19? So the convention is 1 in front of an X for 10. And L and C and M. These are all letters of the Roman alphabet. But you can see it gets a bit unwieldy if you want to do 19, or 18 is even more unwieldy. X for 10, V for 5 is 15, I, 16, 17, 18. How much simpler just to borrow an Arabic letter, modify it slightly, and end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., the numbers that we call Arabic numerals. So that's an important contribution, I think you would agree. The Muslims didn't invent chess. Indians did that some 400 years before. But what the Muslims did was appreciated this was a wonderful intellectual exercise in order to strategize. And they were the first to produce a manual on how to win at chess. Because of the prescription on the human image in Islam, certainly in the context of religion, calligraphy developed into a very florid form. And I think it doesn't require much imagination to see how elaborate calligraphy such as this translates into the design motif we call arabesque, which in turn is the progenitor of Art Nouveau, which we're going to talk about, microphones permitting, on Friday. What about medicine? If you were sick in the Middle Ages in Europe, you went to a monastery or a nunnery, and there you would be admitted in order to die with your soul cleansed, because medicine really didn't have a great deal to contribute in Europe from the year about 400 till about 1100, 900, 1000. Hospitals in Europe were essentially hospices, places where you went and the nuns were as concerned with the health of your soul before you died as with the illness that brought you there in the first place. Whereas in the Muslim world in 800 AD, major Muslim cities had general hospitals. And in the hospitals, they were divided into wards. Are we doing all right with the sound? Good. The hospitals were divided into wards. And in each ward were patients with a particular condition, whether it was respiratory or whether it was a broken bone. And the object of putting them in wards was that you could see the natural history of the condition, because there'll be a spectrum of patients with that particular condition. So as a physician, you could observe, because that's the beginning of understanding medicine, you could observe these patients and learn from them, and then hopefully try different treatment strategies and see what was helpful. They didn't have the concept of the placebo, but if you knew the natural history of the disease, you had a pretty good idea whether your treatment was effective or not. What a huge advance that was. While the nuns were looking and doing their best, and people just went in European hospitals to die. They also had annexed to these general hospitals outpatient clinics. What an interesting concept, and that's where we are today, of course. Contribution of Islam to Western culture. And coffee, who doesn't like coffee? Coffee started in Yemen, where the indigenous coffee plant was cultivated, the beans were roasted, and it was an aromatic drink which became popular. And the beans were then exported from the port of Mocha on the Red Sea coast of Yemen, and British, Dutch, French, German traders came to take shiploads of coffee beans to Europe, and coffee became a popular drink. The bean of the coffee that grows in Yemen is the most aromatic of all the coffee beans. There are now hybrids all over the world growing coffee, of course, but those beans are generally called Robusta because they have not much intrinsic flavour, and you can add vanilla and all sorts of other cinnamon and other things to make the coffee taste reasonable. The bean from the Yemen is called Arabica, and that is the finest coffee. So if you're going to buy yourself some coffee, pay the little extra and get the Arabica beans, which are rare, difficult to cultivate, and therefore a bit more expensive, but in a completely different league from Robusta. But the Yemenis were pretty smart. They wanted the revenue from exporting their coffee beans, but they were afraid that those who purchased them would plant them in their own places and develop rival plantations. So before exporting them, they were roasted, which is pretty clever. To my mind, the most important single contribution of Islam to Western thought, not all the things that we've just talked about, which are pretty enormous, but is that Islam was the custodian of Greek and Roman philosophy during the Middle Ages, when Christianity held the monopoly for intellectual thought throughout that period. And any philosophical view about man or life or anything else that was in conflict with Christian teaching was either ignored or suppressed. As a consequence, scholars who were used to working freely in Greek and Roman society felt stifled in Europe and travelled eastward, ending up in Baghdad, bringing with them the original Greek and Roman texts. sorry, where am I? There we are. Bringing the original Greek and Roman text with them. And there in Baghdad, they were translating Greek and Roman texts into Arabic. Why is that important to Western culture? It's important because in about 1250, Genghis Khan, as we're going to see later on this morning, swept through the Arab lands and were as inhibiting as the Christian church had been in early Europe. And as a result, the scholars now had the original texts of Homer, Aristotle, Hippocrates in Arabic, which they then took back. And these became the foundation of the Western universities in 1100 and 1200, the Arabic texts now being translated back into the original Greek and into original Latin. So it sounds a little bit bizarre, but if you think it through, we would not have had universities developing in Europe, the University of Paris and Oxford and Cambridge and various other distinguished institutions, if it were not for the Arabs who had been the custodians of Greek and Roman philosophical thought. So in a way, we could probably stop now and have lunch, because that in a nutshell is the contribution of Islam. But as we've got a little bit of time, give me a second if you would. I hate doing this in the middle of talking, but it's a little bit drying to project the voice so far. So forgive me for 2 seconds. So, I think it behoves us to know a little about Islam to try to get it all in perspective. And of course it started with the birth of the Prophet Muhammad in 570 on the western side of the Arabian Peninsula in the town of Mecca. And he was a trader of the Quraysh tribe, who were pagans. And being so, he married the daughter, the widow of another wealthy trader. And up until the age of 40, Muhammad and his wife, Khadija, were traders, like everybody else. But then he went for a period of meditation in a cave in the mountain of Hira, not too far away from Mecca, and came back, and while in the cave, he had a series of divine revelations via the Archangel Gabriel. And he continued to have a series of revelations for the next 23 years, amounting to some 114 in all, which are in fact now recorded as the 114 surahs of the Quran. These are the divine revelations that Muhammad had. He went back in Medina, in Mecca, to preach the principles of these divine revelations, which were a cross-current between Judaism and Christianity, with Abraham and Moses, prophets of Judaism, and Jesus, the prophet of Christianity. And he was now going to preach the merit of a single God, as the Jews and as the Christians had done, but interpreted through the revelations, divine revelations that he'd had in this cave and subsequently. So a spokesperson for God for the Jews, a spokesperson for God for the Christians, and now a spokesperson for God for the Muslims. As he started to preach this, the elders of the Quraysh tribe, the pagans, began progressively to get more and more anxious that their traditional way of life and religion and thought was going to be suppressed and replaced. So they drove Muhammad out, and he went north several hundred kilometers to the north to a town of Yathrib. And Yathrib was an interesting place. Whoops, not sure what's happened to... There's the Quran. There is Yathrib. This is a satellite view of Yathrib, which is a couple of hundred kilometers north of Mecca. And we're looking down on a range of mountains, and you can see just about slightly above the center there, a greenish light area. And this is an oasis which was very fertile. And it was surrounded by mountains, so Muhammad felt protected there in case people, the Quraysh people would come from Mecca and attack him. He gathered followers around him, and he was there for 7 years. And having gathered enough followers, he then went back to Mecca with what looked like an army of followers and actually overthrew the pagan deities, establishing at the site of the pagan temple what we now call the Kaaba, which is now the focal point for worldwide Islam, of course, and it's the exact site in Mecca where the original pagan temple stood. Muhammad died at the age of 62 without leaving a successor, and this was a problem. It was agreed among his followers that they would come to an agreement that there would be a succession of 4 righteous caliphs, as they called themselves. And they were perpetuating, long after Muhammad's death, or shortly after Muhammad's death, perpetuating this religion in that area and carrying the baton. The 4th of these caliphs was Ali, 1, 2, 3, 4th from the center there. And Ali was the youngest of these caliphs, and he claimed to have the right to perpetuate Islam through his bloodline, insofar as he had married Muhammad's daughter Fatima. And therefore their progeny would be carrying the blood of the Prophet, and therefore would be the religious line to be followed for Islam henceforth. And the followers of Ali called themselves followers in Arabic Shia. That did not sit well with the descendants of the earlier caliphs, who had, after all, perpetuated Islam for a long period of time and felt that they deserved the right to continue the perpetuation of this religion and broaden its reach. And one of their number, from the tribe of Umayyad, took over, and he was powerful, ambitious, and as a consequence, he founded a dynasty. And their tentative belief, they didn't call themselves Shia because they were not followers of the bloodline of Muhammad, but they called themselves Sunni from the Sunnat. And the Sunnat is the book of statements by Muhammad, Muhammad's views and opinions, not the Quran, which were the divine revelations, but the Sunnat are the sayings of Muhammad, which guided Muslim life henceforth. And so they called themselves Sunni as the followers of the Sunnat. And that difference between the two lines is the source going back all the way to 700, 600, today still an eternal conflict in the Islamic world between Shia and Sunni, but that's where it came from. The first of the Umayyad caliphs, therefore, it was ambitious to propagate this religion through an area that was basically pagan, and within 30 years of the death of the Prophet, Islam had reached as far as Isfahan in Iran, and as far as Fustat, which is a town that existed next to what is now Cairo. Within 30 years, that area had become Islamic. And it is within the next 60 years that Islam expanded through to Afghanistan in the east, all the way as far as the Atlantic Ocean on the west. Extraordinary speed with which it developed. And I think, in fairness to say, that the direction of the travel was across North Africa, which was barely populated, so there was very little resistance. But that said, it is a remarkable achievement that within 110 years of Muhammad's death, all that green was Islamic. And there is a survivor of that early Umayyad period in Damascus. And Damascus is a blighted city, as in a country that is blighted and been destroyed virtually. But there remains here, in this contemporary photograph, the great mosque in Damascus. There you can see it in the center there. And note that the minarets of the mosques are essentially lookout towers, watchtowers, to protect the mosque. And the basic architecture of the mosque, a prayer hall you can see on the right there, and a large courtyard and the minarets, which served a protective purpose as much as to summon the faithful to prayer. And here we see some of the first cross-currents culturally coming in. Because Islam had now expanded into Iran, we're now getting Iranian influences in the architecture. Here is inside the courtyard of the Damascus Mosque, and you can see this polygonal treasury here, where the treasures of the mosque are kept, with stucco work, which was a purely Iranian invention. And inside the mosque there were mosaics, because they had seen the mosaics of the Byzantines. And so there we are already beginning to see a little bit of cross-fertilization of architectural ideas, and we'll see many more of them. The expansion of Islam was so rapid that it's shocking in some respects to think that within 60 years of the death of Muhammad, The Dome of the Rock was built on a citadel in the center of Jerusalem, on the highest hill in the center of Jerusalem, which is a hilly city. The Dome of the Rock there was the place interpreted by the Jews whose temple had been destroyed by the Romans and by the Christians because of the Christian essence in Jerusalem, and a bit of an affront to those two peoples and their religions to have a Muslim shrine built bang in the middle, right under your nose, as it were. But that shows the confidence that the Muslims had. And why is it the Dome of the Rock? It's not a mosque. What it is simply a golden dome over the rock itself. And we're going to pause for 1 second. Can we try that? Is that better? Oh, my goodness me. 1, 2, 3. Are we still okay now? Yes. Hallelujah. The moral of this story is carry a AA battery in your pocket always. Are we all right? We're good. Okay, now we can proceed at a slightly faster clip and try to get you back to your lunch on time. The Dome of the Rock is actually over the rock, and there is the rock. And in Islam history, the story is that Muhammad left Mecca and made a night journey to Jerusalem, and there ascended on a winged beast to heaven in order to see the face of God, returned back to earth and went back to Mecca. And this was the so-called night journey of Muhammad, and this is the rock from which it is said that he ascended to heaven. Islamic elders now say that that, of course, is not a physical journey, but it's a spiritual journey, and I think we can relate to that as a concept. The mosque itself, of course, is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, placed here at the site of the original Jewish temple next to the Dome of the Rock. But the one that we see now, if you visit Jerusalem, is not the original one built by the Umayyads in 600, but is in fact the 4th or 5th iteration, the others having been destroyed by a series of earthquakes. Because Islam had expanded so far, the caliphs who now ruled over this territory traveled. They built for themselves desert palaces, and for caravanners now, traders traveling across the desert, or pilgrims going to Mecca across the desert, caravanserais were built. And this is the best preserved one in the middle of a desert. You can see it's a walled enclosure, a rest camp, if you will, for pilgrims and traders in the desert. A narrow entrance to go through, a courtyard for prayer, stalls around where you could buy purchases. There would be stabling for your camel. There would be water for drinking and washing, and there would be accommodation for the travelers themselves. And a whole series of these now exist throughout the Middle East and can be visited. Many have been restored. The Umayyads lasted in a dynasty for just 100 years, but their cousins, who claimed descent from Muhammad's uncle Abbas, then overcame the Umayyads and replaced them with a dynasty known as the Abbasids. And this saw the golden age of Islam, and we'll see why in just a moment. They didn't want to occupy Damascus, but they destroyed the Umayyad dynasty, killing many of the potential pretenders to the Umayyad caliphate, and built their own capital in Baghdad, what is now Baghdad, some hundreds of kilometers to the south. But nothing remains of the original Baghdad, except for this map, which shows a circular citadel there with a mosque in the center, palaces and other noble, important buildings round about, and a system of canals coming from the Tigris River that you can see there. What does remain is this mosque in the neighboring town of Sumara, to which the Abbasid caliphs retired during a period of civil unrest. Not much remains of this mosque, but why I show it is for you to appreciate its enormous scale. You can see visitors at the bottom there, little tiny black dots going through the gap in the wall there. This is the outer perimeter wall of the courtyard, and in Islam, the one and only spiral mosque that you can see 180 feet tall, again, the sheer size. So if this is Samarra, not the most important of the Abbasid cities, you can imagine what original Baghdad must have looked like. And as I said a little earlier, we had the migration of the intellectuals coming from Alexandria, bringing with them the Greek and Roman documents in Greek and Latin to Baghdad, and now they were greeted by the Abbasid, the principal Abbasid Caliph, Harun al-Rashid, who we'll see at the moment, who was the equivalent of the, in Florence, we had the Renaissance sponsored by the family. Here in Baghdad, we had a Renaissance of the Arab world sponsored by Harun al-Rashid, we'll see in a moment, who was a poet, a scholar, a philosopher, as well as a caliph and a theologian. So he was the equivalent of the Florentine Medici. And he built up the library, new books were coming in, these were where the books were translated, the books were important. They were books on mathematics, theology, on Muslim jurisprudence, on medicine, and on astronomy. Astronomy was important because they were great traders, and that was the wealth of the Abbasid center in Baghdad. You needed astronomy to navigate by sea, but you also needed astronomy to navigate across the vast tracts of featureless desert. And here he is. This is Harun al-Rashid, the fifth Abbasid caliph, sitting there in white on the left, as you can see there. And the year is 800. And who is he greeting? None other than the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne. And here's Charlemagne coming with his entourage being received. And so you get some idea of the opulence of the court by the way he is dressed there. He was a scholar, not only promoting poetry, contemporary poetry, but he also sought out Muslim folk tales from going back as far as he could. And those folk tales were grouped together as 1,001 Nights. And this is the frontispiece from a book, a copy of this 1,000 years later in Covent Garden in London, published in 1896. And it tells the story, as you know, of Sinbad the Sailor, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and Al-Adin and his magic lamp. The trade was essentially with China. And what the Chinese would export would be silks, ceramics, and paper. And what the Abbasids would export from the port of Basra to China would be spices, incense, pearls, and ivory. Ivory would be in the form of either tusks, sheets of ivory, or beautifully carved, as you can see. So this gives you some feel for the opulence of the Abbasid court in Baghdad. The importation of Chinese porcelain, they didn't have the knack of the bone china that's almost translucent. You hold it up to a light and you can see right through it. That requires a very special combination of clays and chalks and bone and various things. But they did copy the designs from the Chinese using the fertile soil that came down and opened into the Persian Gulf at the port of Basra. And there was a lot of clay coming down with the river there, and that was suitable for the ceramic industry, and that became established, and they produced fine work, as you can see. They also invented something, and that is the ornamental glass. This is Abbasid glassware coming from Baghdad. And you can see it's a simple glass vase, but on it there have been strips of molten glass of different colors mixed with the minerals of oxides of different minerals to produce different colors. As we're going to discover on Friday, Émile Gallet, working in France, thought he had invented this system of applying liquid molten glass to create his beautiful vases that some of you may even own. It goes back 1,000 years to the glassware that we saw in Abbasid Islam. In metalwork too, just look at this bronze bowl and look at the detail of the work there inlaid with gold and silver. And this is the quality of the work that the Abbasids were producing. And then, of course, there was calligraphy, and this is an art form in its own right. And because the calligrapher is a very respected member of Muslim society, there is a ritual to writing in the Quran. The Quran was originally written on sheep vellum. And the ritual would be very similar to the Jewish scribes who write in the Torah scroll. They would take a bath, they would put on clean linen, they would pray, and then they would start work. And if they should make an error, however small, in the transcription, whether it's the Hebrew Torah or whether it's the Islamic Quran, that whole page would be destroyed, and that would be the end of the day's work, and they would start over the next day. So the parallels between the two cultures are vastly bigger and more important than the differences that separate these two peoples. In order to transcribe the word of God as revealed to Muhammad, a certain script was needed. And the first script that was needed came from Kufa, the town in Iraq of Kufa, known as Kufic Arabic script. And you can see here, it's very stylized. It has presence, it has dignity, it has power. But in truth, it was difficult to read because so many letters looked much like another, particularly before the introduction of the vowel markers that you can see in red and green there. And so it took a little later for the Grand Vizier to one of the caliphs, Vizier Ibn Muqla, to develop a more fluid calligraphic script, which was easier to read, easier to write, quite beautiful to look at, I think, just as a piece of design, even if we're unable to read the words. Plenty of vowel markers and little colophons at the end of each paragraph or each chapter, each verse, to give a pause. That's something that Judaism hasn't quite learned, because if you have to read from the Torah scroll, there is no punctuation whatever from beginning to end. So the Muslims were one step ahead there. Around 1200, because Islam had spread so widely, it was simply no longer practical to have the scribes doing vellum, creating Qurans on the vellum, and permission was finally given to use paper for the Quran, and in order for it to be written more quickly, using everyday Arabic script. But because this was still the word of God as revealed to Muhammad, the page was decorated. And here you can see an enormously rich decorated paper Quran, where the emphasis had gone from the calligraphic script of Arabic to the decoration around a more prosaic form of print. Calligraphy didn't confine itself just to the Quran. It was an integral part of mosque architecture. And can you believe this is a wall in a mosque in Mughal India, now in Pakistan? And just look at the calligraphic transcription from the Quran, passages from the Quran written around the top and around the side, floral decorations inside, more Quranic verses inside, and more arabesques and floral designs, all carved out of stone. Extraordinary. And hanging in the mosque would be glass lamps. They would be illuminated, oil would be in the bottom, a wick, they would glow, and calligraphy, passages from the Quran would be written on the lamps themselves, as you can see there, the passages of the Quran selected where they relate to God and light. And now, because Islam was so widely spread out, all good things come to an end, and this intellectual ferment of the Abbasid rule and the cultural achievements and the things that we've just simply seen and ogled at because they're so stunning. The problem was that it was so widely spread, and with all widespread empires, eventually they fragment because they're far from the center of power. And you can't really keep an eye, if you're a ruler, as to what's going on in the periphery. And so it was with the Arabic portion of the Muslim portion of North Africa. And there another sect claiming descent from Fatima set up a Fatimid regime along North Africa, far away from Baghdad, and they set up their headquarters in what is now Tunisia, in the town of Karaoun, which became another intellectual center for a while, and this was an original Abbasid mosque, which they then took over. But what was interesting about this group of people who formed a sort of fragment of Islam occupying North Africa was they introduced a concept, and the concept was of a theological seminary to be attached to the mosque. And this is the madrasa. And the madrasas caught on very quickly, and the madrasas were then built attached to many mosques throughout the Islamic Empire. And what they taught was theology. Sure, they were a training ground for imams, but much more than that. They taught Muslim jurisprudence, they taught medicine, they taught mathematics, they taught astronomy, and they were, in fact, the prototypes of the curriculum of the European university. So we owe to the madrasa the concept of a European university, and then, of course, everything took off in Europe from then on. And then they decided the Fatimids moved from Tunisia as they had now established control, and they set up their own capital in a town of Al-Qahira, which we now call Cairo, on the banks of the Nile. So there we are. That's the first part of what I wanted to say, with the time as it is. Let me go on, if you may, because I think we now come to something which is very, very fascinating. And that is the interrelationship at the western end of the Muslim empire that took place from about 600 to about 1100, an interrelationship unique, I think, in the history of the world between Muslims